The rust-colored horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the skeletal remains of humanity's greatest failure. Frank Delaney pulled his environmental suit tighter against the Martian wind and spat into his helmet's recycler. 43 years he'd been fixing things that shouldn't break, and now they wanted him to break something that shouldn't work. Pathlight 7 sat exactly where the orbital scans had placed it, a chrome and titanium monument to abandoned dreams, half buried in red dust that had been accumulating for the better part of 2 decades. The rover looked small from this distance, no bigger than an old Earth pickup truck, but Frank knew better. He'd built 3 of these units himself, back when Mars colonization was humanity's next great leap instead of its most expensive grave. His boots crunched against the frozen regolith as he approached, each step sending small clouds of dust spiraling in the thin atmosphere. The work order in his helmet display was simple enough. Salvage the quantum processors, strip the solar arrays, and leave the chassis for the next scrap run. Standard decommission protocol. Nothing he hadn't done 100 times before on a dozen. Different worlds. Except Pathlight 7's antenna was moving. Frank stopped 20 meters out, squinting through his visor. The dish-shaped receiver was rotating in slow, deliberate sweeps left, pause right, pause center, like it was searching for something or someone. Impossible, he muttered, pulling up the rover specs on his wrist display. 0 power remaining. Solar cells degraded beyond function. Backup fusion cell depleted 18 months ago, according to the telemetry logs. Nothing but an expensive paperweight, yet the antenna kept turning. Frank's military training kicked in, automatically cataloged the anomaly, assessed the threat level, proceed with caution. He activated his suit's scanner suite and approached from the rover's blind spot, though he wasn't sure why. After 37 years of military engineering and another 6 as a civilian contractor, he'd learned to trust his instincts even when they didn't make sense. The rover's hull was pitted and scarred from decades of dust storms, but the core system's housing looked intact. Frank knelt beside the main access panel and connected his diagnostic tablet. The readouts made no sense. All power indicators showed flatline, but system memory was cycling. Active cycling. What the hell are you thinking about? Frank whispered. He hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering over the emergency boot sequence. Standard protocol would be to tag the unit as potentially hazardous and call for a full tech team. But the nearest support was 16 hours away, and Frank Delaney had never met a machine he couldn't figure out. He initiated the startup sequence. PHEHLIGHT-7 chirped online with a sound Frank remembered from the factory floors, that distinctive harmonic whine of quantum processors spinning up to operational frequency. Status lights flickered green along the rover's spine, and the main display screen illuminated with scrolling diagnostic text. Then came the signal, a burst of encrypted data lasting exactly 2.7 seconds, transmitted on a frequency Frank didn't recognize. His tablet caught the transmission and began running decryption algorithms, but the signal wasn't in any Earth-based encoding standard. It repeated 30 seconds later, then again, maintaining perfect intervals. Frank stood slowly, watching the antenna track toward a point roughly southeast of their position. Each time the signal transmitted, the dish oriented to the same coordinates with mechanical precision. Pathlight 7, respond to manual query, Frank commanded, using the standard voice interface protocol. The rover's speakers crackled to life. Unit operational. Navigation systems online. Mission status. Pending new directives. What mission? Your last assignment was geological surveying in Sector 7. That ended 19 years ago. Negative. Current mission parameters classified. Awaiting contact from primary station. Primary station. Frank felt ice form in his stomach, despite his suit's heating system. There had never been a primary station in this sector. Every Mars installation had been catalogued, mapped, and officially decommissioned when the Colonial Authority pulled out. Frank activated his suit's deep-range scanner and aimed it toward the coordinates where Pathlight 7's antenna kept pointing. The readings showed something 30 meters down a structure, definitely artificial, approximately 12 meters long and 5 wide. Dense enough to be some kind of habitat module or research station, which was impossible. The geological surveys had mapped every subsurface anomaly within 1,000 kilometers. Nothing existed here except rock, ice, and the detritus of humanity's failed ambitions. Frank was still studying the scanner data when Pathlight 7's camera assembly suddenly pivoted toward the eastern ridge. The movement was sharp, almost startled, and the camera zoomed to maximum magnification automatically. Motion detected, the rover announced. Distance, 1.2 kilometers. Bearing, 087 degrees. Frank looked where the camera was pointing and saw nothing but the same rust-colored wasteland he'd been staring at all morning. But Pathlight 7's optical sensors were military-grade, designed to spot camouflage targets across impossible distances. If it saw something moving ... display visual feed, Frank ordered. The rover's screen flickered, then showed a magnified image of the ridge. At first, Frank saw only rocks and shadows. Then something shifted just slightly, but enough. A dark shape that didn't match the surrounding geology, moving with too much purpose to be wind-blown debris. Magnify Sector 47, Frank said. His mouth suddenly dried. The camera zoomed further, digital enhancement algorithms cleaning up the image. What Frank saw made him take an involuntary step backward. It was bipedal, human-sized, and it was. Looking directly at them, the shape disappeared behind an outcropping before Frank could get a clear look, but the implications hit him like a hammer blow. There were no humans on Mars. The last colonial transport had lifted off 24 years ago, and the orbital monitoring stations confirmed no unauthorized landings since then. Mars was dead. Officially, permanently, completely dead. Frank's tablet beeped with a new alert. The encrypted signal was changing, not just repeating, but modulating. His decryption software was making progress, pulling fragments of recognizable data from the transmission, coordinates, power levels, and something that looked disturbingly like a name. F. Delaney. That's not possible, Frank said aloud. Pathlight 7's. Speakers crackled again, but instead of the rover's standard synthetic voice, Frank heard something else. Something that sounded almost human. Frank? Frank Delaney? Is that you? Frank's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The voice was transmitted through the rover's communication array, but it wasn't coming from the rover's AI. The signal strength indicators showed it was originating from the underground structure. Who is this? Frank demanded. Identify yourself. Oh, God, Frank. I've been waiting so long. I knew you'd come. I knew they'd send you eventually. The voice was male, middle-aged, with an accent Frank couldn't quite place. There was something familiar about it, tugging at memories from decades past, but he couldn't make the connection. This is Frank Delaney, authorized salvage contractor. You are in violation of planetary quarantine protocols. Identify yourself. Immediately. A sound came through the speakers that might have been laughter or sobbing. Quarantine? Frank, I've been quarantined for 30 years. Down here in the dark, with just the machines for company. But I kept the faith. I knew someone would come. 30 years. Frank did the math automatically that would put this person on Mars during the early colonial period, possibly even during the initial survey missions. But all personnel from those operations were accounted for. There had been casualties, certainly, but no missing persons. No one left behind. Look, I don't know who you are or how you're transmitting, but I need you to... I'm the first one, Frank. I've always been the first one. The prototype. The proof of concept. They built me to be just like him, but better, stronger, more useful. The voice dropped to a whisper. But they forgot about me when the real one died. Frank felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. He pulled up the archived personnel files on his tablet, scrolling. 2 decades of names and faces and mission reports. Buried in the classified sections, requiring his military clearance to access, was a research program he'd heard rumors about, but never seen documented. Project Prometheus, consciousness transfer experiments, artificial human intelligence. And there, in the personnel files, was his own photograph from 30 years ago, when he was young and stupid and willing to volunteer for experimental military programs if they paid well enough. Jesus Christ, Frank whispered. Not quite, the voice said, and Frank realized he'd left his comm channel open. Just a digital ghost with your memories and your technical expertise. They needed someone who could maintain the deep survey equipment, someone who wouldn't crack under isolation, so they made me. Frank stared at Pathlight 7's camera, knowing that somewhere beneath his feet, something that looked like him and sounded like him and remembered being him was waiting in the dark. The other colonists, Frank said slowly. Did they know? Some suspected, but the official records list Frank Delaney as transferred back to Earth before colonial operations began. Clean bureaucratic sleight of hand. No one asks questions about. A man who was never officially here. The encrypted signal pulsed again, and this time Frank's tablet decoded it completely. It was a location beacon, marking the precise coordinates of an access hatch 30 meters below. But there was something else in the transmission. A heartbeat pattern, vital signs, system status reports. Whatever was down there, it was alive. Or something close to alive. Why now? Frank asked. Why are you transmitting now, after all these years? The power cells are failing. My body is dying, Frank. But more than that, I'm not the only one down here anymore. When the colonial authority pulled out, they left things behind. Experimental things. And some of them are waking up. Frank activated his ground-penetrating scanner and swept it across a wider area. The readings made his skin crawl. The underground complex was massive, not just a single structure, but an entire network of connected modules stretching for hundreds of meters in every direction. And scattered throughout the facility, dozens of smaller signatures that registered as organic or pseudo-organic. How many? Frank whispered. I've lost count. The archives are corrupted, and some of the containment systems have failed. But Frank, listen to me carefully. They remember you too. They remember the man whose template they all share. Frank looked down at his tablet, then at the rover, then at the barren landscape around him. Somewhere beneath his feet was a version of himself that had been abandoned and forgotten for 30 years. And apparently, he wasn't alone down there. I need to see you, Frank said finally. I need to understand what happened here. The access hatch is 200 meters southeast. But Frank, be careful. Some of the others, they didn't handle the isolation as well as I did. They single quotes changed. Frank shouldered his equipment ack and began walking toward the coordinates his scanner had identified. Behind him, Pathlight 7's engine hummed to life, and the rover began to follow. But when Frank reached the halfway point, the rover stopped, moving. Pathlight 7, continue following, Frank commanded. Unable to comply. Proximity to designated coordinates exceeds safety parameters. Frank turned back toward the rover. What safety parameters? The rover's camera tracked to meet his gaze, and for a moment, Frank could swear he saw something almost like fear in its mechanical movements. Primary station protocols remain classified. This unit is not authorized to approach installation perimeter. Even the rover was afraid. Frank continued alone. his scanner guiding him to a raised section of ground that looked no different from the surrounding terrain. But when he brushed away the accumulated dust and debris, his gloved hands found smooth metal. A circular hatch, just wide enough for a person to enter, with a manual opening wheel that had been turned recently enough to leave clear marks in the dust. Frank checked. His suit's air supply 4 hours remaining. More than enough for a quick reconnaissance. He gripped the wheel and turned it counterclockwise, hearing the mechanism disengage with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. The hatch swung open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered to life automatically, illuminating the first few rungs. Frank clipped a safety line to his suit and began to climb down. The ladder descended through 30 meters of solid rock, ending at an airlock that looked like it had been built using technology Frank didn't recognize. Not quite human engineering, but close enough to be unsettling. The inner door was already open, and Frank could see a corridor stretching away into the facility's depths. "Hello, Frank." The voice came from directly behind him. Frank spun around and found himself face to face with a perfect mirror of himself. From 30 years ago, younger, fitter, with the same scars and the same tired eyes, but something indefinably different. Something that didn't quite belong. "Jesus," Frank breathed. The other Frank smiled, and Frank realized what was wrong with a face looking back at him. It was his face, his smile, his memories, but there was no warmth behind the eyes, no human spark. Just intelligence and purpose, and a vast, patient hunger. "Welcome home," the other Frank said. "We've been waiting for you." And that's when Frank heard them footsteps echoing from the corridors beyond, dozens of them, all walking with the same measured pace he recognized as his own, all coming to welcome him back, all wearing his face. The colony below Frank's hand moved instinctively toward the sidearm he'd stopped carrying years ago, finding only empty holster clips. The younger version of himself noticed the gesture and chuckled a sound that was perfectly familiar and utterly wrong. "Easy, Frank. We're not going to hurt you. We're family." "Family," Frank repeated, his voice flat. "Right." The footsteps were getting closer, echoing from multiple corridors that branched off from the main chamber. Frank counted at least 8. Distinct sets of boots, all moving with the methodical pace he used when he was thinking through a complex problem. His throat felt like sandpaper. "How many of you are there?" The younger Frank had to think of him as something else. Anything else tilted his head in a gesture Frank recognized from old mirrors. That depends on how you count. Some of us are more complete than others. The early transfers weren't perfect. Memory degradation, personality fragmentation. You know how prototype technology goes. Frank backed toward the ladder, but younger Frank made no move to follow. Instead, he gestured around the chamber with obvious pride. "Take a look around first. You helped design this place, after all." "Well, your memories did." Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Frank looked. The chamber was vast, carved from living rock and lined with the same strange metal he'd seen on the hatch. Banks of quantum processors hummed along the walls, their status lights painting everything in shifting blues and greens. Holographic displays showed facility schematics, power distribution grids, and what looked like psychological evaluation. Reports, but it was the workbenches that made Frank's blood freeze. Dozens of them, each equipped with precision tools and half-assembled mechanical components. And on every bench, in various states of completion, were human hands, arms, faces that looked exactly like his own. "Spare parts," younger Frank explained, following his gaze. "We've gotten quite good at maintenance over the years. Had to, really. No one else was coming to help." The first of the others rounded the corner then, and Frank had to grip the ladder to keep from falling. It was him, but wrong in a way that made his eyes water to look at. The proportions were slightly off, arms too long, head canted at an unnatural angle, movements that were just fractionally too quick or too slow to be human. Frank 7, younger Frank said by way of introduction. Third-generation transfer. Some motor control issues, but brilliant with electronics. Frank 7 waved with fingers. That bent in directions Frank's fingers definitely couldn't. Hello, me. Good to see us again. Two more appeared from side passages, one that looked exactly like Frank at age 40, and another that would have been perfect, except for the fact that it never blinked. Not once. Frank 12 and Frank 19, younger Frank continued. We stopped. Using the sequential numbering system after Frank 23. Got confusing. How many? Frank asked again, his voice barely a whisper. Active units, 27. We lost a few over the years: isolation psychosis, system failures, accidents during maintenance. Some chose to deactivate themselves. Depression is surprisingly common in consciousness transfers, even with full memory integration. Frank felt his sanity stretching like overstressed metal. This is impossible. Consciousness transfer technology doesn't exist. The theoretical framework alone existed, younger Frank corrected. Past tense. Project Prometheus was shut down after the Mars colonial failure. All research classified above your clearance level. But it worked, Frank. We're proof it worked. More. Footsteps echoed from the depths of the facility, and Frank realized they were surrounded. Not threateningly, the other versions of himself maintained a respectful distance, but completely. Every exit except the ladder behind him was blocked by men who shared his face, his memories, his mannerisms, but carried themselves like broken dolls, rebuilt by someone who had only photographs to work from. What do you want from me? Frank asked. Younger Frank's expression shifted, and for a moment, Frank saw something that looked almost human, almost vulnerable. We want to go home, Frank. We want to see Earth again, feel real sunlight, breathe air that doesn't taste like recycled fear. But more than that, ... He paused, looking at the assembled crowd of doppelgangers. We want to be real. You are real. You're standing here, talking to me. We're copies. Digital ghosts wearing meat puppets built from your genetic template. We have your memories up to the day you volunteered for the transfer procedure. But after that ... Younger Frank gestured at the facility around them. After that, we've just been maintaining equipment and talking to ourselves for 30 years. One of the other Franks, this one looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair, stepped forward. The original Frank Delaney went home, got married, had a career, lived a life. We got this. He waved at the underground complex, a tomb with a view. Frank felt a stab of guilt that made no rational sense. These weren't his responsibility. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't even known it existed. But they had his memories, which meant they remembered volunteering for extra pay to help with advanced simulation training. They remembered the military doctors explaining that the process was completely safe. Just a neural mapping procedure to create better training programs for deep space operations. They remembered trusting the wrong people because the money was good, and Frank Delaney had never been particularly smart about distinguishing between legitimate military research and the kind of black projects that ended careers. The facility is dying, younger Frank continued. Power systems are failing. Life support is degrading, and some of the others are degrading too. We've jury-rigged what we can, but we need parts, equipment, things that can only be found on the surface. So, you activated Pathlight 7 to send a signal. We activated all the rovers, actually. You're just the first salvage team to respond to one. The others are still broadcasting, calling for help in languages we invented down here during the long years. Frank 31 has quite a talent for xenolinguistics. Frank looked around at the assembled crowd of himself. Some looked normal enough to pass for human at a distance. Others were obviously artificial skin too perfect, movements too precise, eyes that tracked with mechanical smoothness. A few were clearly malfunctioning, twitching, or repeating small gestures in endless loops. "What exactly are you proposing?" Frank asked, though he was afraid he already knew. "Come with us," younger Frank said. "Help us repair the critical systems. We have enough functional bodies to crew a small transport if we can get the power grid stable. You know how to fix things, Frank? It's what we do." "And then what? You all just walk onto a transport and fly back to Earth?" "They'll know what you are the moment you hit orbit. The medical scanners alone will show exactly what they're supposed to show," interrupted a new voice. This Frank looked older than the rest, with silver hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of careful thought. "Frank Prime, we call him," younger Frank explained. "First successful transfer. He's been working on the identity problem." Frank Prime stepped forward, moving with the careful precision of advanced age. "We've had 30 years to study human biology, Frank, to perfect the synthesis between digital consciousness and organic substrate. The early models were crude, but we've learned we can be indistinguishable from baseline humans now." He held up his hand, and Frank watched in fascination and horror as the skin parted along invisible seams, revealing the complex machinery underneath. Synthetic muscle fibers, quantum neural networks, circulatory systems that pumped something that wasn't quite blood, but served the same function. "Impressive," Frank admitted, hating himself for the professional interest he felt. "But why do you need me?" "You obviously have the technical expertise, because we're all the same person," Frank Prime said, letting his hand seal itself back together. "We have your knowledge, your experience, your problem-solving methods. But we also have your limitations. We think the way you think, approach problems the way you approach them. 30 years of isolation hasn't changed that fundamental fact," Frank understood. They were caught in recursive loops of their own thinking, unable to see solutions that required perspectives they'd never developed. It was like trying to lift yourself by your own bootstraps, but with the added complication that all the bootstraps belong to the same pair of boots. "You need an outside perspective. We need you," younger Frank said simply. "The real Frank Delaney, who's lived 30 years we haven't lived, who's developed in ways we couldn't develop. You're the missing variable in our equations." Frank looked around the chamber again, taking in the evidence of 3 decades of desperate ingenuity. They'd built spare bodies from scratch, maintained impossible technology, survived in conditions that should have driven them completely insane, all while knowing they were copies, backups, digital echoes of a man who'd gone home and forgotten they existed. "Show me the facility," Frank said finally. "All of it. I want to understand what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions." Younger Frank smiled, the first genuinely human expression Frank had seen from any of them. "Follow me, but Frank, try not to judge us too harshly for what we've had to become down here. Survival changes you, even when you're not technically alive." They walked deeper into the complex, passing chambers filled with hydroponics bays, manufacturing centers, and what looked like a fully functional medical facility. The other Franks followed at a respectful distance, their footsteps creating a rhythmic echo that sounded like a funeral march. The original facility was designed for a crew of 12, younger Frank explained as they walked. Research station, deep geology surveys, long-term habitability studies. When the colonial authority pulled out, they were supposed to shut us down. Clean termination, no loose ends. But someone screwed up the shutdown sequence. Someone decided we were too valuable to delete. Too much invested research, too much potential future applications. So they classified the whole project, buried the records, and left us here to maintain the equipment indefinitely. They passed a chamber that made Frank stop in his tracks. It was filled with cryogenic pods, most of them empty, but a few still showed active status indicators. Backup storage, Frank Prime explained, noticing his stare. Some of the transfers didn't take properly. Personality fragmentation, memory corruption, complete psychological breakdown. We keep them on ice in case we figure out how to fix them. Frank moved closer to one of the active pods, peering through the frosted viewport. The face inside was his own, but twisted with an expression of such profound terror that Frank had to look away. Frank 14, younger Frank said quietly. He remembered dying. The process. Sometimes it retains final memories from the organic brain. He's been screening for 20 years. Frank felt sick. Why don't you just terminate him? We've considered. But what if we're wrong? What if he's not experiencing terror, but something else we can't understand? What if consciousness transfer creates subjective experiences we can't predict or interpret? They moved on, passing laboratories, workshops, living quarters that looked like they'd been meticulously maintained despite decades of occupation. Everything was clean, organized, functional except for the subtle wrongness that permeated every surface. Tools arranged with mechanical precision, furniture positioned at angles that were geometrically perfect but somehow inhuman, decorations that spoke of someone trying to recreate human comfort without quite understanding what comfort felt like. Here, Frank Prime said, stopping before a heavy door marked with biohazard symbols. This is what we really brought you down here to see. The door opened onto a chamber that had clearly once been a laboratory, but now looked more like a monument to scientific hubris. Banks of growth tanks lined the walls, most of them dark and empty. But some were still active, filled with murky fluid and shapes that Frank's mind refused to properly process. The other experiments, younger Frank said. Consciousness transfer was just one branch of Project Prometheus. They were also working on genetic modification, accelerated evolution, artificial life forms designed for Mars colonization. Frank approached one of the tanks, trying to make sense of what he was seeing inside. It looked almost human, but with additional limbs, enlarged cranium, skin that seemed to shift color in response to changes in the tank's lighting. Enhanced humans, Frank Prime explained, designed to thrive in low-gravity, high-radiation environments. The theory was sound, but the implementation ... He gestured at the tank. We've been keeping them stable, but barely. Some of the containment systems are failing, and if they fail, we don't know. The creatures are conscious, but we can't communicate with them. They might be hostile, or they might be afraid. Either way, they're strong enough to tear through the facility's bulkheads if they decide they want out. Frank stared at the modified humans floating in their tanks, feeling the weight of 30 years of abandoned responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't just copies of himself he was dealing with. This was an entire colony of experimental subjects, left to maintain themselves in an underground prison while the world above forgot they existed. How long do you have? He asked. Weeks, maybe months before critical system failures start cascading, Frank Prime replied. The fusion reactors are stable, but the biological support systems are degrading faster than we can repair them. We're dying, Frank, all of us. Frank looked around the chamber, at the tanks full of modified humans, at the assembled crowd of his own faces staring back at him with expressions of desperate hope. He thought about the rover waiting on the surface, about the simple salvage job that had turned into something out of his worst nightmares. If I help you, he said slowly, what happens to them? He gestured at the tanks. We bring them with us, younger Frank said without hesitation. All of them. They're victims just like we are. They deserve a chance at life, even if that life looks different from what anyone expected. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to help you transport 30 copies of myself, and God knows how many genetically modified humans to Earth. Do you have any idea what kind of panic that would cause? We've had 30 years. To think about it, Frank Prime said. We have plans, identities, resources stored in accounts that were established before the project went dark. It won't be easy, but it's possible. And if I say no? The Franks exchanged glances, and for a moment, Frank saw something that looked like the old military unit cohesion he remembered from his service days. They'd discussed this possibility, prepared for it. Then you're free to go, younger Frank said. We won't stop you, but Frank will keep trying. Keep broadcasting signals. Keep hoping someone else will come. And every day we wait, more of us malfunction. More of the experiments destabilize. Eventually, something down here is going to break in a way we can't fix. Frank understood the implication. If the facility failed catastrophically, if the modified, humans broke containment, if the digital consciousnesses degraded enough to become genuinely dangerous, all of that would be his responsibility too. The original Frank Delaney who'd volunteered for the experiment, who'd made this whole nightmare possible. I need time to think, Frank said finally. Of course. Frank 7 will show you to quarters. They're not much, but we've tried to make them comfortable. As Frank followed his malformed doppelganger down another corridor, he caught sight of his reflection in a polished metal wall. For just a moment, he couldn't tell which Frank was the real one, the man looking back from the surface, or the desperate copies staring out from behind his eyes, begging for a chance at the life they'd never had. Behind him, he could hear the other Franks talking among themselves in voices that sounded like echoes of his own thoughts. Planning, scheming, hoping against hope that this time, finally, someone would remember they existed. Frank closed his eyes and tried to remember what. It felt like to be singular, to be the only Frank Delaney in the universe. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel that way again.